The old tracker spat a wad of tobacco juice onto the damp earth, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "They say the trail starts here," he grumbled, more to his horse than to the nervous traveler who'd hired him. The traveler, a man of science from Boston, adjusted his spectacles, peering into the oppressive twilight of the Mississippi woods. He saw nothing but mud and decaying leaves. "And the tracks, they glow?" the traveler asked, his voice a whisper of skepticism. The tracker only grunted, pointing with his chin. "Only on a moonless night after a hard rain. They say she left a map for others to follow, a way out. But it ain't a map for the living." Just then, a faint spectral light began to pulse from the ground, forming the unmistakable outline of a bare foot, pressed impossibly deep into the soil. The Boston man gasped, stumbling back as another print began to glow, and then another, leading into a darkness that seemed to swallow the light whole. He didn't know that he was looking at the beginning of a legend. A story of defiance that echoed through the ages. He didn't know that some footprints can never be washed away. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The air in Natchez, Mississippi in the year of our Lord 1843 was a thick, wet blanket that smothered you from the moment you were born. It was an air heavy with the sweet, cloying scent of magnolia blossoms and the bitter tang of sweat and sorrow. On the Croft plantation, a sprawling kingdom of cotton and cane built on the backs of 200 souls, that air felt heavier than anywhere else. Dinah Fields knew its weight better than most. She was 17 years old, with eyes the color of dark river water and a stillness about her that the other slaves mistook for slowness, and the master, Alistair Croft, mistook for obedience. They were both wrong. Dinah's stillness was the stillness of the forest floor, a place of deep roots and silent observation, where everything was seen and nothing was forgotten. She spent her days under the relentless sun, her fingers raw from pulling the white tufts of cotton from their thorny prisons. She moved with an economy of motion that was both efficient and invisible, a skill learned early to avoid the lash of the overseer, a man named Jebediah whose cruelty was as predictable as the sunrise. While others sang mournful spirituals to pass the grueling hours, Dinah remained silent. Her song was in her head, a melody of rustling leaves and cricket calls, a private world no one could touch. From the shaded veranda of his grand white pillared house, Alistair Croft would often watch his fields. He was a man carved from granite and pride, his face a mask of stern authority. He saw his slaves not as people but as assets, entries in a ledger, and their compliance was a direct reflection of his own power and control. Any deviation, any disruption to the perfect order of his world was a personal affront. He saw Dinah's quiet diligence and nodded with satisfaction, seeing a perfect cog in his perfectly functioning machine. He never once looked into her river-dark eyes, never saw the currents that ran deep and fast beneath the calm surface. That afternoon, the world began to change. The sun, a merciless white disk in the sky, was slowly being consumed by a bruise-colored bank of clouds rolling in from the west. The air grew thick and still, charged with an electric hum that made the hairs on Dinah's arms stand on end. The birds fell silent. The usual drone of insects ceased. It was a waiting silence, a breath held before a scream. Dinah felt a strange pull, a thrumming in her blood that matched the energy in the air. Her gaze drifted from the endless rows of cotton to the dark, tangled line of the woods that bordered the southern edge of the plantation. The woods were forbidden, a place of snakes, gators, and rumored runaways who had been lost to its depths. But to Dinah, it had always felt like a place of secrets, a place that breathed. The first gust of wind hit like a physical blow, whipping dust and loose cotton fibers into the air. It carried the scent of rain and damp earth, a promise of relief that felt more like a threat. On the veranda, Alistair Croft frowned, annoyed by the impending disruption. A storm meant a loss of work hours. He stood up, his chair scraping against the polished floorboards, and his eyes scanned the property, searching for any sign of disorder. He found it in a small, insignificant detail. A hoe left leaning against a water barrel instead of being returned to the tool shed. It was a minor infraction, something that would normally go unnoticed. But in the charged atmosphere, with his sense of control threatened by the coming storm, it became a symbol of unacceptable laxity. Jebediah. Croft's voice was not loud, but it cut through the rising wind with the sharpness of a whip. The overseer, a burly man with a perpetually sunburned neck, hurried over from the stables. "Sir?" Croft pointed a long, pale finger towards the hoe. "Whose responsibility was that?" Jebediah squinted, then his eyes fell on a young boy no older than 12 who was struggling to secure a loose shutter on the barn. "That'd be young Peter, sir. I'll see to it." "You will not," Croft said, his voice dangerously soft. "An example must be set, publicly, after the evening meal. 10 lashes for carelessness." A tremor of fear went through the nearby slaves. 10 lashes was a harsh punishment for such a small thing. Peter, hearing his name, froze, his face a mask of pure terror. Dinah's heart clenched. Peter was her cousin, a gentle boy who tried so hard to be good, to be invisible. She looked from his terrified face to the cold, unforgiving set of her master's jaw, and in that moment, the silent song in her head stopped. It was replaced by a single deafening note of defiance. She did not know she was going to move until her feet were already carrying her forward. She walked out of the cotton row and stopped at the edge of the manicured lawn that separated the fields from the great house. "Sir," she said. Her voice was clear and steady, not loud, but it carried an authority that made both Croft and Jebediah turn in surprise. No slave ever addressed the master so directly unless spoken to. "It was me, sir. I used the hoe last. I left it there." It was a lie, a blatant, foolish, and suicidal lie. Jebediah's eyes widened in disbelief. Peter stared at her, his mouth agape. Alistair Croft's eyes narrowed into slits. He walked slowly down the veranda steps until he was standing directly in front of her. He was a tall man, and he loomed over her, a monolith of white linen and righteous anger. "You are claiming responsibility for this girl?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "Yes, sir," Dinah said, her gaze unwavering. She did not look at the ground, as she was supposed to. She looked directly into his cold blue eyes. For a heartbeat, Croft was taken aback by her audacity. He saw not fear, not submission, but something else, something he couldn't name. It infuriated him. He raised his hand, not to strike her, but as a gesture of dismissal, of utter contempt. "The punishment stands," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "But it will be 20 lashes now. For your insolence as well as your carelessness, you will learn your place." As he turned his back on her, the heavens broke. The first drop of rain, fat and heavy, splattered in the dust at Dinah's feet. Then another and another. A jagged fork of lightning split the sky, followed an instant later by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The world erupted into a chaotic symphony of wind and water. The slaves scattered, running for the meager shelter of their cabins. Jebediah yelled at them, his words lost in the roar of the storm. But Dinah did not move. She stood there as the rain began to plaster her thin cotton dress to her skin, her eyes still fixed on the master's back as he retreated to the safety of his porch. She looked at the great house, a fortress of power and pain. She looked at the terrified face of her young cousin peering from behind a cabin door. And then she looked to the south, to the dark, waiting woods. And she ran. She did not run towards the cabins. She did not run towards the road that led north. She ran straight towards the forbidden woods. She ran with a purpose that defied logic, her bare feet pounding against the rapidly softening earth. Jebediah saw her go and shouted, "Girl, get back here!" But his voice was swallowed by the storm. Croft, watching from his veranda, saw her flight not as an escape, but as the ultimate act of defiance, a final, unforgivable disruption of his order. He watched her dark form grow smaller and smaller until she was swallowed by the tree line, just as the sky opened up completely, unleashing a torrential downpour that blurred the entire world into a churning gray wall of water. The storm raged all night, a biblical fury of lightning and thunder and rain that seemed intent on washing the world clean. By morning it was over. The sun rose into a sky that was scrubbed and polished, shining down on a world that was sodden and transformed. The cotton fields were a sea of mud, the roads impassable. Alistair Croft stood on his veranda, sipping his morning coffee, his anger from the night before having cooled into a hard, cold resolve. The girl, Dinah, had not returned. She had spent the night in the woods, a foolish, petulant act. He would find her, and the example he would make of her would be etched into the memory of every slave on his plantation for a generation. He summoned Jebediah and 2 other men. "She can't have gone far," Croft said, pulling on his tall leather boots. "The storm would have stopped her. We'll track her. I want her found before midday." They started at the edge of the woods where she had last been seen. The ground was a soupy mess, a landscape of puddles and rivulets of running water. Any track, any sign of passage should have been obliterated by the sheer volume of rain that had fallen. But then Jebediah stopped, his mouth falling open. "Master," he whispered, pointing. "Look!" There at the edge of the tree line were footprints. They were the prints of a single person, barefoot, heading directly into the woods. But they were impossible. The mud around them was soft and washed, but the prints themselves were perfect, each toe and the curve of the heel defined as if pressed into firm, dry clay. They were pressed unnaturally deep, a good 2 inches into the ground, as if the person who made them weighed as much as a draft horse. Croft stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. "This is some trick," he muttered. He knelt, touching the edge of one of the prints. The mud was firm, almost hard, while the earth an inch away was soft and yielding. It was as if the rain had fallen everywhere except for the exact space where Dinah had placed her feet. "They lead into the woods," one of the men said, his voice filled with a new superstitious fear. They followed the trail. Print after perfect print, each one a stark, impossible indentation in the sodden earth, leading them deeper into the dripping green twilight of the forest. They were a silent, defiant path, a declaration that could not be erased. The rain had washed the world clean, but it had not touched the footprints of Dinah Fields. They remained, a testament to her flight, a mystery that was just beginning, a scar on the land that would never, ever fade. Alistair Croft's breath caught in his throat, a dry, rasping sound that was shockingly loud in the unnatural quiet of the morning. He was a man who believed in order, in ledgers and laws, in the clear and brutal logic of cause and effect. What he was seeing defied all of it. The footprints were an insult to reality itself. He straightened up from his crouch, wiping his muddy fingers on his trousers with a gesture of disgust, as if trying to wipe away the impossibility of it all. "It's a trick," he repeated, his voice harder this time, trying to force the world back into its proper shape through sheer will. "She had help. Some buck hiding in the woods laid down stones for her to walk on and then pulled them up after." Jebediah, whose face was the color of old parchment, shook his head slowly, his eyes wide with a fear that was more primal than anything Croft had ever seen in the man. "No, sir," the overseer whispered. "There ain't no stones, look." He gestured with a trembling hand at the next print and the one after that. They were a perfect, unbroken chain leading into the tangled gloom. "The ground is firm inside 'em, hard as a brick, but right here," he poked a thick finger into the mud an inch from the edge of a print, and it sank into the soft, wet earth. "It's all soup. No man could do this." The other two men, field hands named Marcus and Silas, hung back, their faces masks of superstitious dread. They clutched the handles of their axes not like tools, but like talismans against a gathering evil. "We are wasting daylight," Croft snapped, his fear transmuting into a hot, familiar rage. "She is a runaway slave. That is all she is. And we are going to find her and bring her back. Now move!" He pushed past Jebediah, his expensive leather boots sinking into the mire, making obscene sucking sounds with every step. He made a point of walking beside the tracks, not in them, as if to touch them would be to acknowledge their reality. The men followed, their reluctance a palpable weight dragging behind them. The woods closed in around them almost immediately, the dense canopy of oak, cypress, and sweet gum blocking out the morning sun and plunging them into a world of green twilight. The air was thick with the smell of wet soil, decaying leaves, and the sweet, heavy perfume of jasmine that had been beaten from its vines by the storm. Water dripped from every surface, a constant monotonous percussion that did little to soothe their frayed nerves. Their progress was slow and miserable. They slipped and slid in the mud, their boots becoming heavy with clinging clay. Thorny vines hidden in the undergrowth snagged at their clothes, tearing at fabric and skin. The forest floor was a treacherous obstacle course of slick, moss-covered roots and unseen puddles. Yet the trail they followed was serene and clear. The footprints proceeded in a straight, unwavering line, a path of impossible stability through the chaos. Each print was a small miracle of defiance, perfectly formed, perfectly firm, a silent rebuke to the struggling men who followed. Croft's fury grew with every labored step. He was the master of this land, the owner of the girl who had made these tracks, and yet the very earth seemed to have conspired with her against him, granting her an easy passage while fighting him at every turn. "She's a witch," Silas muttered from the back of the group, his voice trembling. "She called down the storm and made a pact with the devil." "Shut your mouth, you fool," Croft snarled, turning on him. "There are no witches, there is only insolence and defiance, and it will be punished." But his words lacked conviction. The evidence of something unnatural was literally at his feet. He looked at Jebediah, expecting his brutish overseer to back him up to mock the field hand's fear. But Jebediah was silent, his gaze fixed on the tracks ahead, his face grim. The overseer had seen 1,000 things in his life, had delivered and witnessed every kind of brutality imaginable. But this was different. This was a power he did not recognize and could not dominate with a whip or a fist. They walked for what felt like hours, the only sounds their own labored breathing and the constant drip of water. The footprints never faltered. They led them deeper and deeper into the swampy heart of the woods, into territory the men usually avoided. Then they came to a creek. The night's rain had turned it from a gentle stream into a rushing, muddy torrent, a good 15 feet across. It was too deep to wade and too fast to swim safely. The trail of footprints went directly to the water's edge, and there, on the opposite bank, it continued, just as clear, just as perfect, as if the raging water did not exist. There was no fallen log to serve as a bridge, no shallow spot for a crossing. There was no sign of disturbance in the churning brown water, no displaced mud on the far bank where a person would have scrambled out. It was simply impossible. This new miracle broke something in Marcus. He stopped dead, shaking his head, his eyes wild. "No more," he said, his voice cracking. "I ain't following no ghost. This ain't natural. She drowned in that water, and her spirit is leading us to our doom." Croft rounded on him, his face purple with rage. "You will do as you are told. You will cross this creek if I have to throw you across." "You can whip me, Master Croft," Marcus said, taking a step back and holding his axe up, not as a threat but as a barrier. "You can sell me, but I ain't setting foot in that water. I ain't following them tracks another step." For a moment it seemed Croft would strike him, but then he saw the look in Silas's eyes, the same terrified refusal. He even saw the doubt in Jebediah's stony face. His authority for the first time in his life was crumbling, washed away not by rebellion but by a quiet, superstitious terror he could not fight. He was alone. As the men stood in their standoff, Dinah was miles away, curled in the hollow of a great ancient cypress tree. She had not consciously chosen this sanctuary any more than she had consciously chosen her path through the woods. During the storm, she had simply run, propelled by a force she did not understand. The terror of the whipping, the cold fury in Croft's eyes had been the spark, but the storm itself had been the fuel. As the rain lashed down and the lightning tore the sky, she had not felt fear. She had felt a strange and overwhelming sense of belonging. The roar of the wind was a voice she recognized, the flash of light a glance she understood. Her feet had not slipped in the mud. With every step, she had felt the ground beneath her firm up, rising to meet her, creating a solid purchase where there should have been none. It was as if she was not running from the plantation, but being drawn into the woods, welcomed by the storm as one of its own. She had run until her lungs burned and her legs ached, but it was an ache of exertion, not of panic. The forest, usually a place of menace, had felt like a shield, its tangled branches and deep shadows a protective embrace. She had found the hollow tree by instinct, crawling into its dark, dry interior just as her strength gave out. She had slept through the worst of the storm, a deep, dreamless sleep, cradled in the heart of the ancient wood. When she awoke, the world was quiet. A soft green light filtered into her hiding place. She was stiff and sore, but a profound sense of peace settled over her. The crushing weight of the plantation air was gone, replaced by the clean, living scent of the forest. She was hungry and she was lost, but for the first time in her 17 years she felt free. The feeling was so new, so vast, it was almost frightening. She peered out of the hollow. The world was a dripping, glistening tapestry of green and brown. She had no idea which way to go, no plan for what to do next. But the panic she expected to feel did not come. Instead, she felt a quiet hum of energy from the ground beneath her, a subtle vibration that seemed to rise up through the roots of the cypress and into her own body. It was a feeling of guidance, a silent promise that she was not alone. She thought of Peter, of the terror on his face, and knew she could never go back. The lie she had told, the defiance she had shown, it had changed her. It had broken a dam inside her, and a river of long suppressed strength was now flowing free. She did not know what the impossible footprints meant, had no idea of the consternation they were causing the men who hunted her. She only knew that when she had run, the earth had held her up. She placed a hand on the rough bark of the cypress, a silent thank you, and then stepped out into the new day. She took a deep breath, and without knowing why, she began to walk north. Back at the creek, the argument had subsided into a tense, angry silence. Croft, realizing he could not force the men across, had resorted to threats of future punishment. But the spell of his power was broken. He paced the bank, his mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation, a foothold for his rational mind in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Jebediah, meanwhile, was staring at the footprints on the far side of the creek. He had seen many things, but he had never seen magic. He had always believed that the world was a hard, simple place governed by strength and pain. Now he wasn't so sure. He looked from the impossible tracks to the dark, brooding forest beyond, and for the first time he felt like an intruder. He felt small. As the afternoon wore on, the light in the forest began to change. The bright green of midday softened into a deeper, more mysterious shade of emerald. Long, slanted shadows began to stretch across the forest floor. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of the woods began to change. The daytime chirps and rustles replaced by the evening calls of frogs and the first tentative hoots of an owl. Croft, defeated for the moment, finally gave the order to turn back. They would return to the plantation, gather more men, ropes, and dogs. He would not be beaten by a slip of a girl and some swamp magic. He would tear the entire forest down if he had to. As they began their miserable trek back, none of them looked behind them. If they had, they might have seen it. As the last rays of direct sunlight vanished from the sky, leaving the world in a deep purple twilight, the footprints that marked Dinah's path began to change. It started subtly, a faint internal shimmering, as if they were filled with captured moonlight. Then, as the darkness deepened, they began to glow. It was a soft, phosphorescent light, a pale, silvery blue luminescence that pulsed gently in the gathering gloom. The tracks, which had been a mystery by day, were becoming a legend by night. They were no longer just a path of escape. They were becoming a map, a glowing supernatural road leading away from the world of men and into the heart of a secret, ancient power. The scar on the land was beginning to shine. The return to the plantation was a slow, sullen procession of failure. Croft, Jebediah, and the two field hands trudged out of the woods covered in mud, their clothes torn, their faces grim. The setting sun cast long, accusatory shadows before them, and the grand white house, usually a symbol of Croft's power, now seemed to mock him with its pristine, orderly facade. Slaves finishing their evening tasks or gathering near their cabins fell silent as the defeated party emerged. They saw the master's thunderous expression, the overseer's haunted eyes, and the palpable fear radiating from Marcus and Silas. They saw the mud and the exhaustion, and they saw that Dinah was not with them. A current of unspoken communication, a silent language of glances and barely perceptible nods, passed through the quarters. It was a current of wonder, of fear, and of a dangerous, burgeoning hope. Croft felt their eyes on him, and each silent stare was a fresh sting to his wounded pride. He stormed past them without a word, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the polished veranda floor, a desecration he didn't even notice. He slammed the door to his study behind him, the sound echoing through the unnaturally quiet house. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hand shaking with rage, and downed it in one fiery gulp. He paced the room, a caged animal, his mind a whirlwind of fury and disbelief. It was impossible, a simple girl, a storm, and some mud. It had to be a trick. He tried to rationalize it, to force the jagged pieces of the day into a shape that made sense. The ground, he reasoned, must have some peculiar mineral composition. The footprints, perhaps an illusion created by phosphorescent fungus, a phenomenon he had read about in a Boston journal. The girl was simply lucky, stumbling upon a strange natural anomaly. He clung to these explanations like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood, but the image of the perfectly formed prints leading into the churning creek kept pulling him under. His anger, needing a target, settled on the men. Their superstitious cowardice was the reason for this failure. He would not make that mistake again. He strode to the door and bellowed for Jebediah. The overseer appeared moments later, his face still pale beneath its weathered surface. "Gather the dogs," Croft commanded, his voice low and venomous. "And find me Cole and Reuben. We go back at first light. I want every man from the north fields armed and ready to follow. And I want it known. $50 for the man who puts the rope on her. Alive. I want her alive." Jebediah hesitated, a rare and dangerous act. "Sir," he began, his voice rough, "them tracks, they ain't normal. The dogs, they might not take a scent like that. It's a cold trail, sir. Colder than it ought to be." Croft's eyes blazed. "Are you telling me my hounds are as useless as my men? They are bloodhounds, Jebediah. They can track a ghost through a graveyard if I command it. Make them ready." Jebediah gave a curt, joyless nod and retreated, the master's fury washing over him but failing to warm the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He had trained dogs his whole life, and he knew what they could and could not do. And he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that no dog would follow the path Dinah Fields had made. Miles away, under the canopy of the darkening swamp, Dinah walked on. The hunger that should have been clawing at her belly was a dull, distant ache. The forest, which should have been a place of terror, seemed instead to be providing for her. As thirst began to parch her throat, the sound of trickling water grew louder, leading her to a small, clear spring bubbling up from between the roots of a willow tree. The water was cool and sweet, the purest she had ever tasted. A little farther on, she found a patch of muscadine vines heavy with ripe purple fruit. She ate them gratefully, their sweetness bursting in her mouth, a gift from the woods. She felt a strange and growing connection to the world around her, a web of sensation she had never known. It was more than just seeing and hearing. It was a deeper sense of knowing. She could feel the presence of a deer watching her from a thicket before she saw the flicker of its ear. She could sense the subtle shift in the air that heralded a change in the wind's direction. It was a language without words, an awakening of a part of herself that had been dormant, buried under years of servitude and silence. As she walked, her thoughts drifted back to the plantation, but the memories felt distant, like scenes from another person's life. The sting of the overseer's words, the weight of the master's gaze, the endless back-breaking rhythm of the cotton fields, it all seemed to belong to a girl who no longer existed. The girl who had lied to the master, who had run into the storm, was someone new. She thought of her mother, who had died when Dinah was just a child. Her mother had been from a different place, captured and sold from a land far to the east, and she had carried with her stories of the old ways, whispers of a time when people could speak to the earth and the sky, when the spirits of the ancestors walked in the rustling leaves. Dinah had always loved the stories but had dismissed them as fanciful tales to soften a harsh reality. Now feeling the hum of the earth beneath her feet, a vibration that seemed to guide her steps, she wondered. She wondered if her mother's stories were not stories at all, but forgotten truths. Her path was blocked by a wide, stagnant bayou, its black water mirroring the twilight sky. The surface was still, but she could sense the ancient reptilian life that drifted just beneath it. A line of alligators lay partially submerged on the far bank, their eyes like cold, yellow stones. There was no way to cross. For the first time since her flight, a flicker of true panic touched her. She was trapped. The woods behind her, the impassable water before her. She closed her eyes, her heart beginning to pound, the old fear threatening to reclaim her. But then she focused on the feeling, the quiet thrumming in the soles of her feet. It was still there, a steady, reassuring pulse. It did not urge her forward, but to the left, along the edge of the water. She opened her eyes and followed the feeling. It led her along the muddy bank to a place where a series of cypress knees, gnarled and ancient, formed a half-hidden ridge. It looked treacherous, a slippery, uncertain path through the murky water. But the feeling from the earth was insistent, a clear and undeniable pull. Trusting the instinct that had not yet failed her, she took a step, and then another. her bare feet finding solid, unseen ground beneath the dark water. A secret bridge laid just for her. At the first hint of dawn, Croft and his new posse assembled. It was a much larger group this time, nearly a dozen men armed with rifles and axes, their faces grim in the gray light. Cole and Reuben, the plantation's most feared slave catchers, held the leashes of 4 massive bloodhounds who whined and strained, eager for the hunt. They rode on horseback to the edge of the woods, the mood tense and determined. Croft would not be denied a second time. They reached the spot where the trail began, and they all stopped. The footprints were still there. The morning dew lay thick on the surrounding grass and mud, sparkling like a carpet of diamonds. But the prints themselves were dry, perfect and untouched, as if covered by an invisible shield. A nervous murmur went through the men. This was not right. "Bring the dogs," Croft commanded, his voice tight. Reuben led a large hound named Brutus to the first footprint. The dog, which had been pulling eagerly at its leash, suddenly stopped. It lowered its head, sniffing at the impossible track, and then recoiled as if struck. A low whine escaped its throat, and the fur along its spine bristled. It backed away, its tail tucked between its legs, its eyes wide with a terror that was utterly alien to its nature. "Get on with it, you useless cur!" Croft roared, dismounting and striding forward. He grabbed the dog's collar, trying to drag it back to the print. Brutus fought him, digging its claws into the soft earth, its powerful body trembling. Croft kicked the animal in its ribs, a brutal, frustrated blow. The dog yelped in pain, but still refused, pulling so hard against the leash that it choked itself, its eyes rolling back in its head. Jebediah, who had been watching with a grim sense of vindication, stepped forward. "It's no use, sir," he said, his voice flat. "I told you. They won't take it." He pointed to the other 3 hounds. They were all cowering behind the catchers, whining and refusing to move forward. They feared the trail more than they feared their masters. The failure of the dogs was a devastating blow. These animals were legends, relentless and infallible. Their refusal was a more powerful testament to the wrongness of the trail than any human fear. The new men in the posse exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado from the night before evaporating in the strange, dewless presence of the footprints. The story of the witch girl was no longer a whisper in the slave quarters. It was a terrifying reality standing before them. Croft stood over the first perfect, glowing footprint, his face a mask of impotent fury. His dogs, his men, the very ground beneath his feet had all betrayed him. He was a master who had lost his dominion, a man of logic and order whose world was shattering against a power he could not comprehend, a force he could not whip into submission. He looked into the dark, silent woods, and for the first time in his life, Alistair Croft felt the cold, sharp sting of true fear. The girl was gone, and in her place a legend was rising, its path lit by a light he could never hope to extinguish. The abject terror of the hounds was a contagion. It spread from the animals to the men, a silent, sickening wave of understanding that what they were hunting was no longer just a girl. Alistair Croft felt it, a cold knot tightening in his stomach, but his fear was instantly cauterized by the hot blade of his rage. He was the master. This was his land, his property, and the laws of nature, of God himself, were subordinate to that simple, brutal fact. To be defied by the very soil under his feet was an ontological insult that his entire being rejected. "Useless," he spat, the word a spray of venom. He turned his back on the cowering dogs and the pale, unnerved faces of his men. His eyes, chips of blue ice, swept over them, dismissing their collective fear as a personal failing, a weakness he would purge. "Cole, Reuben, get those pathetic animals out of my sight. Take them back to the kennels. If they will not hunt, they will not eat." The two slave catchers, men known for their own brand of casual brutality, exchanged a nervous glance but obeyed without a word, practically dragging the whimpering hounds away from the glowing trail. Croft's gaze then fell on the remaining posse, the field hands who stood shuffling their feet, their eyes darting anywhere but towards the woods or their master. "The rest of you," he began, his voice deceptively calm, "will go back to the north fields. There will be no rest today. You will work until I say you can stop. The time wasted on this fool's errand will be made up." He remounted his horse in a single fluid motion of pure anger, his authority reasserting itself through sheer intimidating force. Only Jebediah remained, his face a stony mask that couldn't quite hide the deep unease in his eyes. "Sir," the overseer said, his voice low, "what are your orders?" Croft stared down at him, a long, chilling silence stretching between them. "My orders, Jebediah, are to succeed," he said finally. "This plantation is a machine. That girl is a broken cog. I will not have my machine compromised by superstition and cowardice. If my tools are faulty," he paused, letting the threat hang in the air, "I will acquire new ones." He wheeled his horse around, kicking it into a gallop, not back towards the great house, but east, towards the road that led to Natchez. He would not rely on his own compromised men any longer. He would go to the city, to the dark and grimy corners where men's souls were bought and sold for coin, and he would hire professionals. He would find men whose only god was money, men who would track the devil himself for the right price, and he would unleash them on this swamp. He would have his property back, and he would make an example of her that would burn away this burgeoning legend and cauterize the hope it was beginning to breed. While Croft's rage propelled him towards civilization, Dinah was moving deeper into the wild heart of the swamp. The bayou crossing had been a test of faith, a step into the unknown that had rewarded her with solid ground. On the other side, the character of the forest changed. The trees were older, larger, their branches draped in thick shawls of Spanish moss that swayed like gray, silent ghosts in the humid air. The light here was different, filtered through the dense canopy into a soft cathedral, like gloom. The hum she felt from the earth grew stronger, more distinct. A clear and steady vibration that was no longer just a guide, but a companion. She walked for another hour, the feeling leading her to a small, almost perfectly circular clearing. In the center stood the skeleton of a cabin, its roof long gone, its walls a lattice of weathered gray wood slowly being devoured by a riot of jasmine and trumpet vine. It was a place of profound peace, a ruin that felt more like a monument. It did not feel abandoned, but merely asleep. Drawn by an invisible thread, she stepped through the empty doorway. The floor was a soft carpet of moss, and in the center, a circle of stones marked a hearth that had been cold for a century. The air inside was still and smelled of damp earth and sweet, decaying wood. Running a hand along the inner wall, her fingers brushed against something that was not the rough texture of the wood. She looked closer. Carved into the planks were symbols, patterns she had never seen before. They were not letters, but intricate, spiraling designs, some that looked like stylized leaves and roots, others that resembled the patterns of water flowing around a stone. They felt familiar, resonating with a part of her she was only just beginning to discover. She traced one of the spirals with her finger, and as she did, the hum in the earth beneath her feet intensified for a moment, a warm pulse that traveled up her arm and settled in her chest. She felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of connection, a feeling of being known. Someone like her had lived here, someone else who could hear the earth's song. This was not just a shelter, it was a sanctuary, a legacy. Back on the Croft plantation, the sun beat down on the north fields with a vindictive intensity. The men who had been part of the morning's failed hunt worked in a sullen, punishing silence, their backs aching, their minds replaying the scene with the dogs over and over. The news of the second failure had spread through the slave quarters like wildfire. It was all anyone could whisper about as they worked. They spoke in the coded language of the oppressed, a dialect of lowered eyes, subtle gestures, and half-unfinished sentences. The story was growing, changing with each telling. Dinah had not just run, she had flown. The footprints were not just glowing, they were burning. The dogs had not just whimpered, they had howled in agony at the mere scent of her power. Peter, her cousin, worked alongside the others, his small hands struggling to keep pace. He felt a terrible, aching guilt. This was his fault. If he had just put the hoe away, Dinah would still be here. But beneath the guilt was a fierce, secret pride. His cousin, quiet, still Dinah, had faced the master and had not flinched. She had walked into the storm, and the storm had not harmed her. She had run into the woods, and the woods had hidden her. He looked towards the southern tree line, and for the first time it did not look like a place of menace, but a place of possibility. The whispers of the others swirled around him. Some were afraid, certain that the master's rage would now fall on all of them, that this act of defiance would only bring more suffering. "He'll sell us all south," one old man muttered, his face a mask of despair. "This kind of trouble, it don't just go away." But others were lit from within by a dangerous new light. "The ground held her up," a woman whispered, her voice filled with awe. "The rain wouldn't touch her. She's blessed. She's a sign." The community was fracturing along a new fault line, between the old fear that had kept them alive and a new hope that might get them killed. That evening, Jebediah sat alone on the steps of his small, grim cabin, the scent of his uneaten dinner growing cold on the table inside. He was methodically oiling a leather strap, his hands moving with a practiced efficiency that required no thought. His mind was far away, trapped in the green twilight of the woods. He was a man who understood the mechanics of fear. He knew how to measure it, how to apply it, how to use it as a tool to shape human behavior. His entire world was built on the simple principle that enough pain could make any creature compliant. But the terror he had seen in the eyes of the hounds was not a fear he could measure. It was an absolute primal rejection of an unnatural presence. It was a fear of the soul, and Jebediah, who had long ago dismissed the notion of his own, was shaken to his core. He thought of the footprints, so perfect, so serene in their defiance. He had stood over them, had felt the strange firmness of the ground within their outline, and had felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was the coldness of the unnatural, the coldness of the grave. He had spent his life enforcing the master's order, a brutal but predictable system. Now a 17-year-old girl had introduced a variable that did not fit into any of his equations. He found himself remembering stories his grandmother, a woman brought over from the islands, used to tell in a hushed voice, tales of women who could talk to the wind and men who could borrow the strength of the trees. He had laughed at them then, the foolish superstitions of an old woman. He was not laughing now. He looked down at the strap in his hands, a tool of his trade, a symbol of his power. For the first time it felt flimsy, useless, a relic of a world whose rules no longer seemed to apply. The gas lamps of Natchez cast a greasy yellow light on the muddy streets, turning the city's opulent facades into monstrous, shadowed things. Alistair Croft ignored the respectable avenues, guiding his horse into the labyrinthine alleys of Natchez under the hill, a place of legendary depravity. Here, the air was thick with the stench of cheap whiskey, unwashed bodies, and despair. This was where fortunes were lost, where men were killed for the change in their pockets, and where any service could be procured for the right price. He dismounted in front of a saloon called the Serpent's Coil, a notorious den of river pirates, gamblers, and slave catchers. He pushed through the swinging doors, his fine clothes and arrogant demeanor instantly marking him as an outsider. The raucous noise of the bar died down, replaced by a low, predatory hum. He ignored the stares, his eyes scanning the room until they found his quarry. In a dark corner, a man sat alone, cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a long, wicked-looking knife. He was lean and wiry, with a face devoid of any discernible emotion. His eyes were a flat, dead gray, like river stones. This was Silas Kane, a name spoken in fearful whispers on plantations from Mississippi to Louisiana. He was a man who had never failed to bring back his target, dead or alive. Croft approached the table. "Silas Kane?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. The man looked up slowly, his dead eyes taking in Croft's expensive boots, his tailored coat, his manicured hands. He did not speak, merely raised an eyebrow. "I have a job for you," Croft said, getting straight to the point. "A runaway girl, she's fled into the Blackwood swamp." Kane gave a slight, mirthless smile. "The Blackwood is hungry this time of year," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "Lots of folks go in, not many come out." "I am not paying you for folklore," Croft snapped, his patience thin. "I am paying you for results. The girl is 17, unarmed, alone." Kane went back to cleaning his knife. "If she's in the Blackwood, she ain't alone. And if she's easy, you wouldn't be in a place like this talking to a man like me. What's the catch, planter?" Croft hesitated, the rational part of his mind screaming at him not to speak of the impossible footprints, not to reveal the madness of it all. But he knew he had to. Kane was a professional. He dealt in facts, however strange. "There are complications," Croft admitted, his voice tight with humiliation. "The trail is unusual. My men, my dogs, they refuse to follow it." Kane stopped his work, his eyes narrowing with the first flicker of interest. "Unusual how?" Croft took a deep breath. "The tracks she leaves. The rain doesn't wash them away. They glow in the dark." The saloon, which had been listening with held breath, erupted in a low murmur of laughter and disbelief. Kane, however, did not laugh. He simply stared at Croft, his expression unreadable. He had heard the whispers, the strange tales coming out of the Croft plantation. A witch girl, they were saying, a storm walker. He had dismissed it as slave superstition, but this man, this proud, wealthy planter, was here in this den of thieves, his face a mask of desperation, confirming the impossible. Kane was a man who believed in only one kind of magic, the magic of gold, and the look in Croft's eyes told him there was a great deal of gold to be had. "It will cost you," Kane said, his voice flat, $1,000 in gold. Half now, half when I bring her back." The price was astronomical, an absolute outrage, but Croft did not even flinch. He reached into his coat and threw a heavy leather pouch onto the table. The clink of coins was the only sound in the room. "Done," Croft said. "I want her back alive. I have plans for her." Kane picked up the pouch, weighing it in his hand. He looked from the gold to Croft's burning eyes, and then he gave a slow, predatory smile. "For $1,000, planter," he said, his voice a low promise. "You can have whatever is left of her." As the deal was struck in the smoky gloom of the saloon, Dinah sat in the doorway of her ancient cabin, watching the moon rise over the swamp. She was not afraid. The panic and terror that had defined her life were gone, washed away by the storm. In their place was a deep, resonant calm, a sense of purpose that hummed in her bones. She could feel the world around her with a startling new clarity. She could feel the slow, patient life of the trees, the cool, dark pulse of the water, the tiny heartbeats of the sleeping animals. And she could feel something else, a new vibration coming from the east. It was a discordant, jagged feeling, sharp and metallic and cold. It was the feeling of Silas Kane's knife, the feeling of Croft's gold, the feeling of a hunt that was colder and more relentless than anything she had ever known. The earth was warning her. She placed her hand on the mossy ground, a silent acknowledgement. The legend of the glowing footprints had bought her time, but that time was over. The real trial was just beginning. She was no longer running. She was preparing. Silas Kane did not believe in ghosts, but he believed in patterns. As he rode out of Natchez in the pre-dawn chill, the heavy pouch of Alistair Croft's gold a satisfying weight against his hip, he sorted the facts of the job as he would the pieces of a puzzle. A 17-year-old girl, a flight into the Blackwood swamp, footprints that defied the rain and glowed in the dark. The planter's story was ludicrous, the stuff of slave superstition and campfire tales. But the gold was real, and the desperation in Croft's eyes was real. Kane's experience had taught him that when a man of wealth and power was driven to such desperate measures, the truth of the situation, however strange, was less important than the opportunity it presented. He was not being paid to understand the magic, only to overcome it. He had brought with him not a posse, but a single silent companion, a Choctaw man named Istil, whose knowledge of the swamp's secret ways was said to be absolute. Istil rode a small, tough marsh pony, his face as unreadable as a stone, his presence more a part of the landscape than an intrusion upon it. Kane's own preparations were meticulous and stripped of all sentiment. He carried a long rifle, 2 pistols, and the wicked-looking knife he was never without. His supplies were lean dried meat, hardtack, and a water skin, enough for a week if needed. He did not bring dogs. If what the planter said was true, dogs would be a liability, their animal senses overwhelmed by whatever unnatural scent the trail possessed. He would rely on his own eyes, on Istil's knowledge, and on the cold, hard logic that had never failed him. Every creature, whether man or beast, ghost or girl, had a pattern. It had needs, it had habits, it had weaknesses. Find the pattern and you find the prey. The glowing footprints were not a deterrent, they were a beacon. They were a mistake. They were a sign of arrogance, and arrogance was a weakness he knew how to exploit. He would not be intimidated by the swamp's reputation or the girl's supposed power. He was a predator, and this was just another hunt. The only difference was the quarry and the price. In the heart of the swamp, Dinah was learning a new language. The carvings in the ruined cabin were her primer, the humming earth her teacher. She spent the day tracing the ancient symbols, not with her mind, but with her spirit. She let the feeling of each spiral, each stylized root and water pattern sink into her. It was a slow, meditative process. As she traced a carving that resembled the interlocking branches of a cypress, she felt a corresponding awareness spread through her, a sense of the vast interconnected root systems beneath the soil, a network of silent communication. When she traced a symbol like a flowing river, she felt a sudden, clear understanding of the water's path. The hidden currents in the bayou, the places where the ground was firm and where it was a treacherous illusion of mud. She was not just feeling the earth, she was beginning to understand its grammar, its syntax. The power that had risen in her during the storm was not a blind, instinctual force. It was an inheritance, a knowledge that had been waiting in her blood for the right moment to awaken. The discordant feeling from the east, the cold, sharp vibration of the hunt, was her focus. It was a jagged tear in the otherwise harmonious tapestry of the swamp. She used it as a whetstone, sharpening her new senses against its abrasive edge. She learned to gauge its distance, its direction, its intensity. She could feel the cold resolve of the man Kane, a feeling utterly different from Croft's hot, prideful rage. This new threat was patient, intelligent, and utterly without mercy. It would not be fooled by simple tricks. It would not be turned back by fear. She knew she could not stay in the cabin, this peaceful sanctuary. It was a place of learning, but not a place of battle. She needed to move, to use the entire swamp as her shield and her weapon. Before she left, she took a piece of charcoal from the ancient hearth and, on a strip of peeled cypress bark, she began to copy the symbols from the wall. She did not know why, only that she must. They were her birthright, the forgotten language of her people, and she would not leave them behind. Cain and Istil found the beginning of the trail just as the sun cleared the horizon. The scene was exactly as Croft had described it. The ground was churned and muddy from the passage of the first posse's horses, but the footprints themselves were pristine, a line of perfect dry indentations leading into the woods. Cain dismounted, crouching beside the first print. He felt the air above it, noting the subtle difference in temperature. He scraped at the mud beside it, comparing the texture. He did not touch the print itself. Istil stood back, his dark eyes taking in the entire scene, his face impassive. "The ground is angry here," he said, his voice a low rumble. Cain grunted, ignoring the cryptic comment. He saw the tracks not as magic, but as information. They were deep, suggesting a weight far greater than a young girl's. They were perfectly formed, suggesting a slow, deliberate pace, not a panicked flight. And they were heading in a straight line, suggesting a clear destination. "She's not running," Cain said, more to himself than to Istil. "She's walking." He rose and looked at his companion. "Can you follow her without the tracks?" Istil's gaze lifted from the footprints and scanned the woods, reading 1,000 signs Cain could not see. A broken twig, a disturbed patch of moss, the flight of a bird. "She is the tracks," he said simply. "Where they go, she has been. But she leaves other signs. She is not a spirit, not yet." They entered the woods, Istil taking the lead. He moved with a silent, fluid grace, his eyes constantly scanning, reading the story of the swamp. Cain followed, his own senses on high alert. He noted how the glowing tracks, even in the daylight, seemed to suck the color from the ground around them, leaving the mud a dull, lifeless gray. They followed the path to the rushing creek where Croft's posse had been forced to turn back. The footprints led to the water's edge and reappeared on the far side, a clear, unbroken line. Cain studied the banks, the current, the debris washed up by the storm. He saw no sign of a crossing, no displaced stones, no mud slick where someone had scrambled out. He looked at Istil, who was staring at the water with intense concentration. "The water did not touch her," Istil said. "She walked on the memory of the ground beneath it." Cain's rational mind rebelled against the statement, but he filed it away as another piece of the puzzle. He was not here to debate metaphysics. He was here to cross a creek. He and Istil spent the next hour working their way upstream, eventually finding a place where a massive fallen oak formed a precarious bridge. They led their horses across carefully and then worked their way back downstream until they picked up the trail again. They had lost 2 hours, but they were still in the hunt. The chase settled into a grim, relentless rhythm. Istil, with his preternatural senses, followed the subtle disturbances in the swamp's life, while Cain kept his eyes on the glowing trail, using it as a compass, a constant confirmation of their direction. He began to notice inconsistencies, patterns within the larger pattern. The footprints were always perfectly spaced for a walking gait, even in places where the terrain was treacherous, where a normal person would have had to scramble or leap. They passed through thickets of briars so dense that Cain and Istil had to hack their way through with knives, yet the trail proceeded in a straight line, as if the thorns had parted for the girl. Cain's initial assessment that the girl was arrogant began to shift. This was not arrogance, this was control. She was not just moving through the swamp, she was commanding it. Dinah felt their progress, a steady, grinding pressure against her senses. They were slow, but they were relentless. The man Cain was intelligent. He was not just following the path she had left, he was studying it, learning from it. She knew she had to do more than just walk. She had to think. She had to use the knowledge the cabin had given her. She came to a wide, marshy area a field of tall reeds and stagnant water. The direct path was straight through it, but she knew the ground was a treacherous, sucking mud. Instead of crossing, she let the earth guide her to the left along the edge of the marsh. She found a place where a series of half-submerged logs formed a winding, almost invisible path. As she crossed, she focused her intent, her will, on the path behind her. She did not know if it would work, but she had to try. She pictured the logs shifting, rolling, sinking just beneath the surface of the murky water, leaving the path impassable but not obviously so. When Cain and Istil reached the marsh, they paused. The glowing footprints led directly into the reeds. "She walks on water now?" Cain asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Istil did not answer. He was scanning the edge of the marsh, his head tilted as if listening to a sound only he could hear. He pointed to the left. "She walked there," he said, indicating the series of logs. "The wood is still wet where she stepped." Cain followed his gaze. The path looked solid enough. He took a step onto the first log, testing it with his weight. It held firm. He took another step and then another. He was halfway across when the log under his foot suddenly rolled, plunging his leg into the cold, black water. He cursed, scrambling for balance, his boot filling with foul-smelling mud. He managed to pull himself back onto a more stable section, his legs soaked to the thigh. He looked back at the log he had stepped on. It was now floating freely, having detached from whatever had held it in place. Istil watched him, his expression unchanging. "The swamp does not want us here," he said. Cain glared at him, then back at the trail. He was beginning to agree. The incident at the marsh was a turning point. Cain realized he was no longer just tracking a person, he was engaged in a contest of wills. The girl was actively working against him, using the environment as her weapon. His professional detachment was beginning to fray, replaced by a grudging, dangerous respect. This was no simple runaway. This was an adversary. He became more cautious, more observant, testing every foothold, questioning every seemingly easy path. The hunt slowed, but it became more intense, a silent chess match played across miles of unforgiving wilderness. Dinah, feeling his caution, his heightened awareness, knew she had to escalate her efforts. She led them into a section of the swamp known as the Green Maze, a labyrinth of identical moss-draped cypress trees where all sense of direction was lost. She moved through it with an unerring certainty, guided by the earth's hum, while Cain and Istil were forced to rely on their compass and the sun, their progress slowing to a crawl. She did not just pass through, she altered the path. She encouraged vines to hang lower, she nudged fallen branches into their way. She stirred a nest of hornets with a focused thought, forcing them to make a wide, time-consuming detour. Back on the plantation, an unnatural quiet had fallen. With Croft gone and Jebediah in a state of brooding inaction, the usual rhythm of brutality had been suspended. The overseers were hesitant, their authority undermined by the master's own failure. The slaves worked, but their movements were mechanical, their minds elsewhere. The legend of Dinah was a constant, unspoken presence. It was in the air, in the soil, in the silence between the notes of their work songs. Peter found himself looking at the other slaves in a new light. He saw the fear in the eyes of the old ones, but he also saw a flicker of something else in the eyes of the young, a dangerous curiosity, a nascent pride. His cousin had done more than run away. She had shattered the illusion of the master's omnipotence. She had proven that the world was bigger and stranger than the boundaries of the plantation, and that a single act of defiance could make the ground itself rise up in rebellion. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon when Cain and Istil finally emerged from the green maze. They were exhausted, scratched by thorns, and their patience was worn thin. Before them lay a vast cypress dome, a natural amphitheater of ancient trees rising from the water. The glowing trail led directly towards it. Cain raised his spyglass, scanning the massive trees. And then he saw her. She was perched on a high branch of the largest, most ancient cypress in the center of the dome, a good 200 yards away. She was not hiding. She was sitting there, watching them, a small, still figure against the darkening sky. She was too far away to make out her features clearly, but he could feel her gaze, a calm, steady pressure. He lowered the spyglass, a slow, cold smile spreading across his face. The chase was over. The confrontation was about to begin. He looked at Istil. "She's waiting for us." The Choctaw man nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "She has chosen her ground." Cain unslung his rifle, checking the priming. The light was fading fast. He had one shot before darkness fell completely. He would make it count. He was Silas Cain. He had been paid $1,000 in gold, and he always delivered. He raised the rifle to his shoulder, taking a slow, steady aim at the small, distant figure in the heart of the swamp. The hunt was over. The killing could begin. The world narrowed to the bead of the front sight, the distant, still shape of the girl and the vast, empty space between them. Silas Cain's breath was a slow, controlled mist in the cooling air. He was a creature of angles and trajectories, of powder and lead, and in his world this was the final, elegant solution. The swamp, the magic, the fear in other men's eyes, it all meant nothing. There was only the target and the tool. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, a familiar, satisfying kick. The crack of the shot was a violent blasphemy in the sacred quiet of the dome, a sound of sharp, metallic order tearing through a world of soft, green chaos. For a split second, he saw the muzzle flash illuminate the path of the ball, a straight, true line to the heart of the mystery. But the mystery had its own geometry. In the instant the rifle fired, a thick, impossibly dense curtain of Spanish moss, 100 years of growth in a single gray mass, detached from a high branch directly above Dinah. It did not simply fall, it dropped with an unnatural speed, a silent gray shield plunging into the bullet's path. The lead ball, meant for a heart, buried itself with a dull, wet thud in the tangled moss. The heavy mass completed its fall, hitting the black water below with a soft, absorbent splash that barely rippled the surface. Cain stared, his mind refusing to process the event. On the branch where the girl had been, there was nothing. She had not jumped. She had not climbed. She had simply vanished in the instant the moss had fallen. He was left aiming at an empty branch, the echo of his shot mocking him as it died among the ancient trees. He lowered the rifle, a cold knot of disbelief tightening in his gut. This was not a trick of the light, not a lucky coincidence. It was a response, a deliberate, impossible defense. He reloaded the rifle with mechanical precision, his hands steady but his mind reeling. Beside him, Istil had not moved, but his entire posture had changed. He was no longer a guide. He was a supplicant in a place of power. "The Tree Mother protects her own," the Choctaw man said, his voice a low, resonant whisper that was part of the swamp's own voice. "We are not welcome here, Cain. Our hunt is over." "The hunt is over when I say it is," Cain snarled, the shock hardening into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. "I'm not leaving $1,000 of the planter's gold sitting in a tree." He began to wade into the cypress dome, the water shockingly cold against his skin. Istil did not follow. "That gold is an anchor," he called after Cain. It will buy you nothing here but a grave." Cain ignored him, his eyes fixed on the great cypress, the center of this web. He would climb the tree if he had to. He would burn the whole dome down. He would not be beaten. The water deepened quickly, rising to his waist. The mud at the bottom was a thick, greedy sludge that sucked at his boots with every step. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure around his ankle. He looked down and saw a thick cypress root, pale and snake-like under the black water, wrapped around his leg. He cursed, kicking at it, but it was as hard as iron. He had to use his knife to saw through it, the blade grating against the tough, fibrous wood. As soon as he was free, another root seemed to rise from the murk, snagging his other leg. The entire dome was a living trap. Vines thick as a man's arm dangled from the branches above, swaying gently, like prehensile limbs waiting to drop. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of decay and a strange electric ozone, and the water itself seemed to grow heavier, resisting his every movement. It was a slow, suffocating battle against an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. He fought his way forward for what felt like an hour, covering less than 50 yards. He was exhausted, his muscles burning, his body soaked in the foul black water. He looked back. Istil was gone. The Choctaw had simply melted back into the swamp, leaving him utterly alone. A flicker of true fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced Cain's professional armor. He was a man who thrived in the wild, who understood its dangers. But this was not the wild he knew. This was a place with a will, a place that was actively, intelligently trying to kill him. For a moment he considered retreating. He could go back to Croft, tell him the job was impossible, return the gold. But the thought of failure, of being beaten by a 17-year-old girl and some swamp magic, was more terrifying than the grasping roots and the suffocating water. His pride, as much as his greed, drove him on. Then he saw her again. She was standing at the base of the great cypress, on what looked like a small, mossy island. She was perfectly still, watching him, her face calm and unreadable in the deep twilight. She was not armed. She was simply waiting. A triumphant, predatory sneer twisted Cain's lips. He had her. She had nowhere left to run. He raised his rifle again, the heavy, waterlogged weapon feeling like a part of his own arm. "It's over, girl," he rasped, his voice a ragged tear in the silence. He took a step forward, his boots seeking solid purchase. The ground of the little island seemed to welcome him. He took another step, bringing the rifle to bear, his finger tightening on the trigger. The island was not an island. The solid ground was an illusion, a carefully woven mat of roots, moss, and mud, no thicker than a blanket, laid over a deep, ancient sinkhole. As his full weight settled, the mat gave way with a soft, sighing tear. He cried out, a single sharp bark of surprise and terror as the world dissolved beneath him. The black water, thick as tar, rushed in, filling his mouth, his eyes, his lungs. He dropped the rifle, his hands clawing desperately at the slick, yielding mud. The heavy pouch of gold at his hip, the price of his soul, became a lead weight, pulling him down, down into the cold, silent heart of the earth. The last thing he saw was the girl standing on the true bank at the edge of the sinkhole, her expression not one of triumph but of a deep, sorrowful finality. Then the blackness took him, and the surface of the water stilled, leaving no trace that Silas Cain had ever existed. Months bled into one another on the Croft plantation. An unnatural season of decay had set in. Alistair Croft had received no word from Silas Cain. The $1,000 in gold was gone, and the girl was still gone. The legend, however, had returned, stronger and more potent than ever. It was whispered that Dinah had fed the swamp's most feared hunter to the alligators, that she had called down lightning to strike him, that she had turned him into a cypress knee, a permanent twisted monument to his own hubris. Croft's authority, already cracked, now shattered completely. His overseers, spooked by the fates of the hunting parties, enforced discipline with a hesitant, fearful hand. The slaves moved with a new economy of motion, one born not of efficiency but of a deep, collective resistance. Work slowed to a crawl. Cotton went unpicked. Cane rotted in the fields. Croft's ledgers, once a source of pride, became a testament to his ruin. He became a ghost in his own house, pacing the polished floors, drinking heavily, his eyes wild and unfocused. He started seeing things. At night he would swear he saw the faint blue glow of footprints on his expensive Persian rugs, a glowing trail leading from his study to his bedroom. He would wake up screaming, certain he had felt the cold, muddy water of the swamp closing around his ankles. The whispers from the slave quarters reached him, distorted and magnified. They were calling her the Swamp Angel, the Earth Walker. They said she was leading runaways from other plantations through the Blackwood, her glowing path a supernatural railroad to the north. Croft, the man of order, was being consumed by a myth of his own making. His neighbors, once his peers, now shunned him, fearing the contagion of rebellion and bad luck that clung to his name. One moonless, starless night, something in him finally broke. The rage and humiliation curdled into a singular, mad obsession. He could not kill the legend, but he could confront its source. He dressed himself not in his planter's linens, but in the rough clothes of a field hand. He took no gun, no knife. He saddled his fastest horse and rode out, not towards the lights of Natchez, but towards the absolute darkness of the southern woods. He found the trail easily. The footprints glowed with a soft, steady light, a serene and terrible invitation. He dismounted, leaving his horse to wander, and began to walk, following the path of his own destruction. He called her name, his voice hoarse, a sound that was part command, part plea, part prayer. "Dinah!" The glowing path led him on, deeper than he had ever been before. It led him through the green maze, past the treacherous marsh, across the creek that had once been his boundary. It led him finally to the edge of the great cypress dome. The air was cool and still. 1,000 fireflies, or perhaps something else, drifted through the trees, their lights a mirror of the glowing path at his feet. He saw a figure standing by the water's edge near the great tree. It was her. She was taller, it seemed, her form less that of a girl and more an embodiment of the place itself, her silhouette merging with the ancient trees and the hanging moss. He waded into the water, his mind empty of everything but the need to reach her, to reclaim the piece of his world that had broken away and destroyed him. The water was not cold, it was warm like fresh blood. It rose to his knees, his waist, his chest. He did not struggle. He simply walked forward, his eyes fixed on the silent figure until the black waiting water of the swamp rose over his head and welcomed him home. With the master's final disappearance, the last chains fell away from the Croft plantation. The remaining overseers, paid by no one, simply packed their bags and left. Jebediah was the last to go. He stood for a long time looking at the southern woods, his face grim, the strap he had been oiling held loosely in his hand. Then he dropped it in the dust, turned and walked north, a man leaving not just a place but an entire life behind. That night a silent exodus took place, led by Peter, who now carried himself with a quiet strength that was his cousin's legacy. The people of the Croft plantation gathered what little they owned. They walked not as runaways but as pilgrims to the edge of the woods. As darkness fell, the path lit up for them, a road of pale blue-silver light. They followed it without fear, their voices rising in a soft, hesitant song, a spiritual not of sorrow but of deliverance. The legend of Dinah Fields did not end. It became a part of the land itself. Some said she became the guardian of the Blackwood swamp, a spirit of vengeance and protection. Others claimed she led her people all the way to the free lands of the north, and that the glowing trail was the path she left for others to follow. Travelers, men of science and men of faith, would come for years seeking the strange phosphorescent footprints that the hardest rain could not wash away. A trail that started at the edge of a ruined plantation and led into the heart of a mystery. They were a map, a declaration, a scar of light on the dark Mississippi earth. They were the final word in a story of defiance, a promise that when one person dares to walk away from bondage, the very ground will rise up to meet their feet, and the path they forge will light the way for generations to come.